Easter Sunday is a day that has religious significance. But did you ever think that it would impact on employment law? There are some weird and wacky rules when it comes to Easter Sunday that a lot of employers don't actually know about. If you own a shop like a retail business, cafe, or even a restaurant, then this one is definitely for you. But hey, not to worry. If this isn't your area and you own another kind of business, then stick around if you want to just have some fun because it's going to get really interesting. Hi everyone, welcome back to Lawlands. My name is Sanam and thank you so much for tuning in today. Yes, that is right, we're in the realm of weird and wacky Easter Sundays. Now, this is nothing to do with any religious side of things. This is to do with the actual laws that we have that intertwine with employment law, and we probably don't even realize that it exists. Now, before we fully get into it, I just wanted to say, everyone, please like, subscribe, follow. I am loving your support and I really appreciate it. So feel free to reach out, connect with me on LinkedIn. Now, getting into it. So weird and wacky Easter Sunday. I know it's a bit of a clickbaity title, but I promise you it does not get more interesting than this when it comes to employment law. Now, this is going to be an interesting one because it has nothing, absolutely nothing to do with the Employment Relations Act or anything that we would generally associate with employment legislation. It actually has to do with the Shop Trading Hours Act that came out in 1990 and was amended in 2016 or thereabouts, which brought in all these new weird and wacky rules. This is the applicable law here. Like I said, it's not really leaning on the Employment Relations Act or anything like that. That's more like the supplementary legislation. But the main one that we're looking at is the Shop Trading Hours Act. And it only applies to shop trading and people that need to be open. Now, I won't dedicate this episode on what you need to look out for in terms of if you want to trade or not, but the links that I will provide, they will give you some information around that, and feel free to have a dig around. But this is specifically focusing on Easter Sunday. It specifically applies to shops. So just to define what a shop is, it's a building or place or part of a building or place where goods are kept, sold, or offered for sale by retail, and it can include an auction mart, a stall, or any other subdivision of a market. So some examples are dairies and fruit shops, grocery stores, service stations, cafes and restaurants, garden centers even. So it's a full raft of things. You've got a whole list there. And I never had experienced this until I started working in the industry. At the time, I had the most amazing team leader, Kimberly. If you are listening to this, she was absolutely lovely. And the thing that Kimberly brought to the job was the fact that she had basically a decade of experience in hospitality running her own business. And I was shocked when I found out the rules around Easter Sunday. I was shooketh, as they say these days. So what is the weird and wacky part? Well, before we get into it, you know what time it is. It's Laugh with Lawlands, where I give you a dry joke in these episodes. Why shouldn't you tell an Easter egg a good joke? Because it might crack up. It was a knee slapper, that one, everyone. And I hope that you take this joy into your Easter break. But why is it weird and wacky? I don't want to alarm you, but in 2016, this piece of legislation changed, and it basically allowed employees to refuse work on Easter Sunday. Yes, you've heard that right. Easter Sunday, not a public holiday. Why did this come up? I had somebody speak to me recently and they mentioned that Easter Sunday was a public holiday and they were a little bit confused. And then I realized, whoa. I need to have a chat about this because a lot of times people forget that Easter Sunday is not a public holiday and it is actually a day where the employee just gets paid at their normal rate. There is no time and a half. So I said, no time and a half, no day in lieu, none of that kind of stuff. It's just a normal day of work. But the weird and wacky part is that in 2016, when the laws changed, it actually allows an employee, so remember this is that shop trading legislation, it allowed employees to refuse work on an Easter Sunday. Yep, you heard that right. They can literally turn around and say, nah, not going to work on that day. And I started seeing it crop up more and more as I was working in the hospitality industry. And it was so interesting to see this consistently coming up. And it's a loophole that a lot of employees have caught on to, and maybe employers haven't really realized that this is the situation. So definitely for you, if you are somebody that runs a shop and meets some of that criteria that I was mentioning before, if you're in the retail business, in the cafe business, if you're in a pharmacy, whatever it might be, then you really need to listen up because it is so interesting. Yes, an employee can refuse work. Now, according to the legislation, there is a particular section that governs this. It's Section 5H, and it allows for two things under that piece of legislation. So even though this is not a public holiday, an employee has the right to refuse work and, okay, you ready for this? And they don't need to even give you a reason why they're refusing to come into work. That is mind-boggling to me. We don't have anything in the Employment Relations Act or the Holidays Act relating to this. To be honest, I totally forgot that this piece of legislation was governing this because I thought, oh, Easter Sunday might come under the Holidays Act. Nope. It's a completely different piece of legislation. So 5H is what dictates those two things. Employee can refuse work. Second thing, they don't need to give you a reason. I know, it's crazy. But then we go on to, can we make the employee work on a Sunday? So what can we do? Let's say you're running your business, you need them to come in. It's not a public holiday. You're not going to be closing down. There's still people coming in through the shop. What happens there? According to the legislation, Section 5I requires an employer to notify their employees. So the notification period, to be honest, by the time you're listening to this episode, has well and truly gone. It is a month's minimum notice that you need to provide. So that's why it's well and truly past. But I wanted to talk to you about how to navigate it moving forward. So in terms of notice, what is required is basically the piece of notice that you're giving the employee is to tell them that they, one, need to work on the Easter Sunday, and two, the fact that they have the right to refuse to work. So you have to spell that out for them. I know, it's not ideal. Trust me, if you're fuming, if you're frustrated, I get it. It's not ideal. But hey, we can only work with what we've been given and navigate around that. And that is just what we've got to do when it comes to employment law. So what is the notice actually going to include? The notice needs to be in writing, and you need to deliver it either in person or email. I would suggest email. Always put it in writing and send it in a way where you can point to it and go, on this day, this time, this is the paper trail, I sent this off. I always get a bit iffy about it being in person. So maximum notice is 8 weeks. Minimum at the least amount of notice is 4 weeks before the Easter Sunday. So 8 weeks before is the maximum time frame. Anything before that doesn't meet the legislation. And 4 weeks is the minimum that you can send out this particular notification. Also, what happens, because sometimes you've taken over a business or you've got a new employee, maybe they haven't been there for more than 4 weeks or less than 4 weeks, they've just come on board. What happens there? So if it's less than 4 weeks that they've been employed with you, then you need to give that notification as soon as reasonably practicable. So you need to make sure that you get it to them as soon as possible, essentially, is what I would say. So that is the employer side. If you wanted to make them work, you basically have to notify them, telling them of their rights and that you are asking them to work. Now, what happens, because this does happen, when the employee refuses to come in and they do not want to work on an Easter Sunday? Now, again, it's not a public holiday. So it's not like the situation of, hey, it's a public holiday, it's their otherwise working day, they get that off. But what happens if they're meant to come into work and they don't want to come in? We've got Section 5J of that legislation that sets it all out. And it's all about notifying the employer beforehand. And that's the obligation of the employee. So what do they need to do to make sure that they meet the notification requirements? Again, it needs to be, their letter needs to be in writing. It needs to be delivered in person or via email. Now, the other thing that's their criteria. So remember, the employer provides their notice, making sure that at a minimum, it's 4 weeks, at a maximum 8 weeks prior to Easter Sunday. The employee, they need to provide their notice to the employer no later than 14 days after they receive the employer's notification. So let's say that you send out the notification on the 1st of March, then that means that by the 14th of March, the employee needs to have responded and they need to have sent you something through. So no later than the 14-day mark. Now, what happens if the employee hasn't been around for that long? Again, same thing as when the employer provides the notification. If they haven't been around for that long, and let's say they've only been receiving the notification just as soon as they started, it's only been a little bit of time, then as soon as practicable is the same situation and same scenario in this case as well. There are the two notification requirements that you can see between the employee and the employer. Now, what are the obligations of the employer? Because it's not looking good right now, right? It's weird and wacky. It's not looking good. It's not ideal. Section 5K says that an employer's obligations is that they cannot compel an employee to work. If an employee refuses, you cannot turn around and say to the employee, no, you've got to come into work. You can't do that. What you can't do in terms of compelling them, you can't make them work. You can't exert undue influence over them to come into work. And you can't make them work if you haven't provided them notice. Keep that in mind. If you haven't provided them notice and you haven't done all of that on your end, then you cannot force them to come into work. Just because you've missed the notification date, let's say you're listening to this now and you're thinking, oh no, I haven't actually done all of that. This is where most employers get tripped up. They try to shorten the time frame. They try to get it done quickly, but it doesn't work that way because the legislation has it clearly laid out. It has it so far laid out that under that Section 5K, an employee can raise a personal grievance for the fact that they've been compelled to come into work. I know, isn't that crazy? A personal grievance for the fact that they've been told, no, you have to come in. For this law that a lot of people don't even know about, I am sure of it. Now, when it comes to insufficient notice, I think that is the most critical and the most important. Insufficient notice is where I would say that a lot of employers will get tripped up. Let me give you two scenarios, okay? First instance with insufficient notice, let's say you've followed the notice requirements. You've given your notice at a minimum 4 weeks before or at a maximum 8 weeks before the Easter Sunday. Everything's going all great, hunky-dory, it's amazing. And then out of nowhere, the employee has not followed their part. They were meant to notify you within 14 days of receiving that notice from you, and they didn't bother to respond. So what happens there? Check your agreement. Because if your employment agreement say that the employee should be required to work on the Easter Sunday, then you can require them to work on the Easter Sunday. That is if the employee fails on their part. Now we get to what happens when the employer fails on their part, because this is the common issue that would come up time and time again when I was working in advisory in the hospo sector. It would always be that employers had no idea, then out of the blue, employees would request for this day off. If an employer does not follow the notification requirement, so you never send out that letter, you've missed the mark, that 4 weeks is gone, now you're looking at like a similar situation today, you're hearing about it for the first time, you've had an employee request, the employer's actions will be viewed as compelling the employee if you turn around and say to the employee, no, you can't take that day off. So if the employer never notifies the employee and the employee turns around and says, no, I'd like to have the day off and I refuse to come into work, the employer can't make them come in because you haven't followed the notification requirements. So that is really tricky. I get that. And I'll go into kind of how to navigate that in a little bit. The reason why you can't compel them is because of that Section 5K. That Section 5K that says you can't push an employee if you haven't provided thorough notice. That is what this all hangs on, and it can expose you as an employer to a personal grievance claim. So just err on the side of caution. Just be safe when it comes to this. And sometimes you've got to bite the bullet and just give them the day off. Now, in terms of best practices and how to handle these particular requests, let me be a bit practical about this actually. I pull it back. Let me be a bit more practical. Let's say that you've been running your shop and you've noticed regularly that employees are starting to catch on and they're starting to ask for the Easter Sunday off. If that is the case and you are seeing this pattern, nip it in the bud. You know what the requirements are. You need to notify your employees. You need to tell them that they need to either work on the day or they can refuse work, and that you will be open and operating. So you need to do that letter. And if they miss that 14-day cutoff, then they will have to come into work because they haven't given you the notice that they need to give you. So you may be thinking, oh, the employee gets their rights anyways. I get that. But if you are getting situations where it's creeping up and up and up, and a lot of employees are doing this, then you might as well have some sort of process and procedure in place, and check your employment agreements as well. If they miss that notice, then does the agreement say that they need to work on the Easter Sunday? So have a look at all of that. If you haven't done the notification and you receive a request, then remember, you can't probe and ask the employee why. Please refrain from doing that. In this case, no, they can absolutely refuse the work, and do not probe them about it. You have to also grant them the request. So if you've missed your part on the notification, you have to grant them the request. In terms of what the notice looks like when you give it to your employees, I have linked a Employment NZ template that they have provided on what you generally need to say. So that will give you an idea of what's required. So my rule of thumb here would be, first, monitor this in your workplace. See if this is happening in your workplace. If people are catching on and you are getting the numbers climbing up and up and up, and employees are realizing and they keep asking for Easter Sunday off, start doing this notification. What it will essentially allow you to do is you'll know 2 weeks in advance on how to schedule your staff and move them around, and what you need to do to make it work for your business. The last thing you want is when you're down to the wire and the employees turned around and said, actually, no, I'd like to take Sunday off. So don't let it get to that stage. Now, the question that comes up is, what do I pay these employees? Because it is not a public holiday. Keep that in mind. So they will just get paid. Either they can take annual leave on that day, or it would just be an unpaid day for them to not come into work. So they don't just get paid for fun because it's not a public holiday. So keep that in mind as well. No money's coming out of your pocket, but you're just essentially losing a worker for that day because they are not going to be coming into work. At least you're not having to pay time and a half for them to come in. You're not having to give them a day in lieu. You also don't have to pay ordinary pay for a day off, but you can ask them to use their annual leave if they'd like, or they can take it as unpaid leave if they want to do that. So like I said, it's weird. It's wacky. It's really crazy that these laws exist. And I remember when I first stumbled across it years ago, I thought there is no way that this is real. And it absolutely is. It absolutely is. Protect your business. Feel empowered, everyone, because I really want you to understand that there are ways to navigate all of this, even these different pieces of legislation that come up with these different rules that we're just not expecting. So look at it that way, glass half full kind of situation when it comes to this podcast. I really try. Thank you so much for tuning in. Share it with your colleagues, friends, like, subscribe, follow. And if you have any questions, send them through to the asklawlens@gmail.com email. It's a great way for me to understand what you're dealing with and the problems that are happening in the workplace. I can keep them completely anonymous as well. So thank you so much, everyone. That's it from me. I hope you have a lovely day, night, morning, evening, whatever it may be. And I'll see you in the next one, everyone.